Lady Elara lived her life as a perfect, polished lie, a flawless jewel meant to adorn a throne built on her father's treachery. Each morning she was laced into gowns of silk and gold, her hair braided with pearls, a living symbol of Lord Valerius's prosperous reign. But beneath the facade, her soul suffocated. The air in the stone castle was thick with the ghosts of the royal family her father had usurped, their whispers clinging to the tapestries and echoing in the hollow silence of the grand halls. She despised the gilded cage, the cloying scent of roses in the garden that couldn't mask the stench of blood that had purchased her family's power. Her existence was a beautiful, fragile performance, and she feared the day the stage would collapse, revealing the ugly truth she was forced to represent. This quiet torment was her constant companion, a shadow that followed her through the opulent corridors of the White Spire. The courtiers bowed, their smiles like masks hiding daggers of judgment, their whispers dissecting her every move. They saw her father's ambition in her eyes, his corruption in her bloodline, and she could do nothing to deny it. She was a prisoner of her own name, a legacy she never chose. For those of us watching her story unfold, we are scattered across the world, but united in this moment. Comenta de dónde nos ves y suscríbete, porque esta historia apenas comienza. Ahora sí, continuemos. Her silent rebellion was to memorize the names of the wronged, to secretly read the histories her father tried to erase, and to pray for a justice she believed was impossible. Her deepest fear was not of assassins in the night or poison in her wine, but of the moment her father would finally use her as his ultimate political pawn. She had seen him trade lands, titles, and lives with cold, calculating precision, and she knew her turn was coming. More than anything, Elara craved an escape, a world where her name did not mean betrayal, where she could be more than a beautiful ornament in a corrupt court. This hidden desire was a dangerous ember in her heart, a hope for a righteous fire to burn down the rot from within, even if it meant consuming her own house. She was trapped between her duty as a daughter and her yearning for a kingdom free from the sins of its ruler, a conflict that waged a silent, brutal war within her. Then, the whispers from the borderlands grew into a roar that shook the very foundations of the capital. Prince Kaelan, the boy her father had framed and left for dead a decade ago, had returned. He was no longer a boy, but a king, a spectre of vengeance leading an army of monstrous Lycans from the forsaken Shadowlands. Panic seized Eldoria. The formidable regime Lord Valerius had built on a foundation of lies began to crack under the pressure of this primal, unstoppable force. Kaelan's name was a curse on the lips of the nobles who had betrayed him and a prayer for those who still remembered the true king. For Elara, the news was a terrifying storm on the horizon, a harbinger of a reckoning that would spare no one, least of all the usurper's daughter. The inevitable arrived not with the clash of swords at the gates, but with a quiet, chilling summons. A grim-faced royal guard appeared at her chambers, his armor gleaming ominously in the candlelight, and bowed stiffly. "My lady," he announced, his voice devoid of warmth, "Lord Valerius and the council require your presence in the throne room immediately." The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken finality. This was it. This was the moment she had dreaded. She was not being called upon as a daughter to be consulted, but as a sacrifice to be offered. With every step toward the great hall, she felt the cold steel of her gilded cage closing around her, sealing her fate as she walked toward the beast her father had created. The night her world fractured, Elara was only a child, hidden behind a tapestry woven with scenes of mythical hunts. She didn't see the blades, but she heard them. She heard the desperate pleas of the queen, the defiant roar of the king, and then a terrible, final silence that was far worse than the screaming. The scent of iron and rain-soaked stone filled the air, a smell she would never forget. Her father, Lord Valerius, emerged from the throne room not as the trusted advisor she knew, but as a conqueror, his hands stained with the blood of his king. He found her shivering in the dark, and his gaze held no comfort, only a cold, chilling assessment. In that moment, she ceased to be his daughter and became his most valuable possession, the innocent face of a monstrous betrayal. In the years that followed, the White Spire became a prison of whispers. The children of the newly loyal lords, whose parents had bent the knee to her father, treated her like a beautiful, venomous snake. They would fall silent when she entered a room, their games halting as if frozen by her presence. Their eyes held a mixture of forced reverence and deep-seated contempt. They saw the ghost of the murdered king in her posture, the shadow of her father's treachery in her smile. She was a living monument to a crime, and her isolation was absolute. This profound rejection carved a deep wound in her soul, teaching her that she was inherently tainted, forever marked by a sin she did not commit, and thus unworthy of genuine connection or the simple warmth of friendship. Her father reinforced this isolation with his own calculated distance. Lord Valerius raised her not with affection, but with a craftsman's precision. He ensured she was educated in statecraft, history, his version of it, and the fine arts, molding her into a perfect, untouchable princess. Yet, his touch was always cold. His praise a strategic tool to ensure her compliance. She learned that her worth was measured only by her utility to his reign. There were no bedtime stories, no comforting hugs, only lessons on posture and political alliances. This emotional wasteland taught her that love was a fiction, a vulnerability she could not afford. Relationships were merely transactions of power, and she was a commodity to be polished, displayed, and eventually traded for the highest price. To survive the crushing weight of her gilded cage, Ilara cultivated a secret, inner world of rebellion. In the castle's forgotten library, she sought out the books her father had ordered burned, painstakingly piecing together the true history of the fallen royal family, the Lycan-blooded kings. She memorized their names, their faces from hidden portraits, treating their memory as a sacred prayer. In a secluded corner of the royal gardens, shielded by overgrown ivy, she secretly cultivated a patch of wolfsbane, the royal flower of the usurped dynasty. Each bloom was a small, defiant act of atonement, a desperate attempt to honor the ghosts her father tried to erase and to prove to herself that she was more than just the usurper's daughter. This secret life of penance made the very notion of romance an act of profound betrayal. How could she dare to dream of personal happiness, of a love that was her own, when her entire existence was built upon the ashes of another family's joy? Any suitor would be a man her father approved of, another gilded link in the chain binding her to his corrupt legacy. She envisioned a life of polite smiles and hollow vows, a marriage that would serve only to strengthen the foundations of his bloody throne. To protect herself from this fate and to honor the dead, she had methodically built impenetrable walls around her heart, convinced that love was a luxury she had no right to, a weakness that would only bring more pain. The walk to the throne room felt like a final, somber procession toward a sacrificial altar. Each step echoed on the cold marble, a drumbeat marking the end of her carefully guarded life. The tapestries lining the hall, depicting her father's glorious victories, seemed to mock her with their vibrant lies. The guards, standing like stone sentinels, watched her pass with impassive eyes that offered no pity. She steeled her nerves, her hands clenched into fists within the silk folds of her gown, preparing herself for the inevitable announcement. It would be a marriage. She was certain, a strategic alliance with some powerful, aging lord from a wavering house, a final, unbreakable seal on her father's power. She was his ultimate political pawn, and the game was about to reach its conclusion. As she entered the great hall, the scene before her shattered all expectations. The council members were pale, their usual arrogance replaced by a stark, primal fear. Her father sat on the throne, not with the relaxed confidence of a king, but with the tense stillness of a man cornered by a predator. And there, standing before him, was the predator himself, a man cloaked in dark furs, exuding an aura of raw, untamed power that seemed to suck the very air from the room. It was Kaelan, the lost prince, the vengeful Alpha King. The shock of his presence was a physical blow, but her father's next words were the strike that truly broke her. "Ilara," he commanded, his voice cold and absolute. "You will marry him." The world tilted, a horrifying tableau of duty and destruction. En este canal traigo las historias de romance más épicas e intensas. Cada semana, un nuevo mundo, una nueva pasión imposible. Kaelan stood not like a prince, but like a mountain given predatory form, clad in dark, heavy furs that smelled of pine, earth, and blood. He was a stark, wild contrast to the gilded corruption of the throne room. His presence was a physical weight, a primal pressure that made the air thin and the torchlight dim. His hair, black as a wolf's pelt, was unbound and fell across broad shoulders. But it was his eyes that held the court captive, the molten gold of a predator, burning with a decade of cold, calculated fury. He was lean, but every line of his body spoke of honed muscle and lethal grace, the result of a life lived on the edge of survival. When his gaze swept over Ilara, it was not the look of a man seeing his future bride, but of a wolf assessing the chain that was being offered to bind him. He was the Alpha King of a people forged in shadow and exile, and the weight of their expectations pressed down on him as heavily as any crown. The Lycan Pax, who followed him from the forsaken wilds, did not crave peace treaties or political marriages. They craved vengeance. They had suffered under the boot of human prejudice for generations, and Kaelan was their promised retribution, the fang and claw that would tear down the walls of their oppression. He knew that accepting this marriage, this bloodless compromise, would be seen as a betrayal by the most fervent of his warriors. He was caught between his duty to his pack's righteous anger and the strategic necessity of uniting a kingdom that would otherwise tear itself apart in a brutal, bloody civil war, leaving nothing but ashes for him to rule. Beneath the unyielding armor of the Alpha King, the ghost of a betrayed prince still lingered. 10 years in the Shadowlands had taught him to trust no one, to equate vulnerability with death. He was surrounded by the fierce loyalty of his Lycan brethren, yet he was profoundly alone, a king of two worlds belonging fully to neither. He carried the weight of his murdered family's legacy and the burden of his people's future, a solitary figure haunted by the past and uncertain of the path forward. His greatest fear was not the swords of his enemies, but that the feral instincts he had embraced to survive had irrevocably consumed the man he was meant to be, leaving only a monster incapable of building the just kingdom his father had envisioned. This marriage felt like another cage, locking him away from his own humanity. Therefore, he needed her, not for comfort, not for alliance, but for control. Ilara was the living embodiment of the Valerius regime, a symbol of the power he had to absorb, not just destroy. To slaughter the nobles and their families would be to repeat the sins of the man he despised, plunging Eldoria into a cycle of bloodshed that would leave him king of a graveyard. Marrying the usurper's daughter was a masterful, brutal stroke of politics. It was a chain that would bind the wavering human houses to his cause, a public declaration that the old blood and the new power were united. She was a key, a tool, the most valuable piece on the board to secure his throne with minimal loss of life. He saw her as a necessary sacrifice, a bitter price for a stable reign, and he would pay it without hesitation. His golden eyes held Ilara's for a long, suffocating moment, and the entire court held its breath, awaiting the explosion of rage. But it never came. Instead, a slow, chilling smile touched Kaelan's lips, a baring of teeth that held no warmth, only the promise of a cold reckoning. "I accept," he said, his voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate in the very stones of the castle. The words were a death knell for Lord Valerius's hopes and a life sentence for Ilara. With a flick of his wrist, Kalin dismissed the trembling council members as if they were insignificant gnats. "Leave us," he commanded, his authority absolute and terrifying. The great hall emptied in a rush of shuffling feet and rustling silks until only Ilara, her father, and the Wolf King remained in the cavernous, echoing silence. If this type of story grips you, subscribe, because I have many more. Kalin completely ignored the man on the throne, his gaze fixed solely on Ilara, stripping her father of all power and relevance with his silent contempt. The air grew thick, with a tension so palpable it was nearly impossible to breathe. She was no longer a lady or a political pawn in a negotiation. She was the spoils of a war that had just been won without a single sword being drawn. After an eternity of silence, he finally spoke, his voice dangerously soft. "Guards," he commanded, and two of his Lycan warriors materialized from the shadows, their eyes glowing faintly. "Escort Lord Valerius to the dungeons. He has matters to reflect upon." Then his gaze pinned Ilara to the floor. "You," he ordered, the single word a steel trap closing around her. "To my chambers, now." Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was not a meeting. It was a summons. The chambers Kalin had claimed were a stark reflection of the man himself, functional, Spartan, and stripped of all pretense. The opulent tapestries of the former regime had been torn down, leaving bare stone walls that seemed to drink the light from the roaring hearth. The air was thick with the unfamiliar, wild scents of pine, damp earth, and tanned leather, a world away from the cloying perfumes of the court she knew. He had not offered her a seat. Instead, he prowled the perimeter of the room, his movements fluid and silent, a caged wolf assessing the limits of its new territory. Ilara stood frozen in the center, her spine rigid, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She refused to let him see the tremor that ran through her, focusing on the crackle of the fire as his golden eyes burned into her, stripping away every layer of her composure with their predatory intensity. Finally, he stopped his pacing directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Let us be clear," he began, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through her bones. "This is not a union, it is a leash. Your council, in their pathetic attempt to save their own skins, invoked an ancient magical law of unification, a bond forged in marriage between warring houses to force a truce. They believe that by chaining me to you, they can control the beast they see before them." He let out a short, humorless laugh that held no warmth. "They think the daughter of the usurper can gentle the wolf at their gates. They are fools, but their foolishness has presented me with an opportunity, a path to my throne that avoids drowning this entire city in the blood it so richly deserves. You are merely the key to that path." His gaze hardened, a flicker of something raw and pained visible for a fleeting second. "My people have spent a decade in exile, hunted and vilified. They followed me here not for treaties, but for vengeance. They want to see the Valerius line erased from history, its name a curse whispered by ghosts. If I grant them the war they crave, I become a butcher, not a king. I will rule a kingdom of ash, haunted by the same cycle of violence my father fought to end." He took a step back, the admission seeming to cost him something. "I must unite two peoples who despise one another. The Lycans see the humans as oppressors, and the humans see my kind as monsters. This magical pact, this sham of a marriage, is the only thing that can bind them together long enough for a new kingdom to be forged. It is a political necessity I find utterly repulsive." He looked at her then, not as a woman, but as a piece on a chessboard. "So here is my proposal. We will perform the ceremony. We will be bound by this ancient magic. In public, you will be my queen, a symbol of a new, unified Eldoria. You will stand by my side, smile when I command, and we will present a flawless, unshakable front to my pack and your father's snivelling lords." His voice dropped, becoming colder, sharper. "But in private, we are nothing to each other. You will have your chambers, I will have mine. I have no desire for the daughter of the man who murdered my family. You will be my queen in name, and in name only. This is not a marriage, it is a contract, a performance to save a kingdom from its own foolish hatred." "And what is my payment for this performance?" Ilara asked, her voice surprisingly steady despite the violent hammering of her heart. Kaelin's lips twisted into a semblance of a smile, devoid of any kindness. "Your life," he stated bluntly, "and the lives of every man, woman and child within these walls. Without this agreement, my army would tear this city apart stone by stone, and I would not stop them. But I will offer you more than mere survival." He paused, his golden eyes searching her face, gauging her. "I will give you a chance at atonement. You will have a seat on the new council. You will have a voice. You can help me build a just kingdom from the ruins of your father's corruption. I am offering you the one thing you secretly crave, a chance to wash the blood of your family's legacy from your own hands." The offer hung in the air between them, a shocking, impossible lifeline. Everything he said was true. He had seen the deepest, most hidden desire of her heart, the desperate need to rectify the sins of her name. For years, she had felt like a ghost in her own life, a silent mourner at the grave of a kingdom she never knew. He was offering her a cage. Yes, but it was a cage with a purpose. A chance to protect the innocent, to influence the future, to finally do something that mattered more than wearing silk and smiling at corrupt old men. It was a terrifying pact with the devil, but the devil was offering her a sliver of redemption. The weight of her father's crimes and the future of Eldoria's people settled onto her shoulders, and she knew there was only one choice she could make. She lifted her chin, meeting his predatory gaze with a newfound resolve that surprised even herself. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a fierce, defiant purpose. She would not be a passive victim in this story. If he intended to use her as a symbol, she would become a symbol of her own making, one of resilience, of hope, of a bridge between two worlds. She saw the path forward, fraught with danger and hatred, but it was a path. For the first time in her life, she felt the stirrings of her own power, a strength forged in isolation and shame. She would walk into this fire not as a sacrifice, but as a survivor who was about to make her own terms with the flames. She would be his queen, but she would be a queen on her own terms. "I accept," she said, the words clear and unwavering in the tense silence of the room. A flicker of surprise crossed Kaelin's features before his mask of cold authority slammed back into place. He gave a curt nod, as if the transaction was complete, and began to turn away. "On one condition," she added, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. He stopped dead, his back still to her, every muscle in his body tensing. Slowly, he turned to face her, his golden eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. The air crackled with a new, challenging energy. "My father lives," Ilara declared, her gaze locked with his. "He will be stripped of his title, his lands, his power. He will be exiled to the northernmost keep for the rest of his days. But you will not execute him. That is my price for this crown and this chain." The ceremony was an exercise in brutal contrast, a collision of two worlds forced into a fragile union. It was held not in the sun-drenched sept, but in the cold, cavernous throne room. Stripped of its valerious tapestries and banners, bare stone walls drank the flickering torchlight, casting long, dancing shadows. Kaelin's Lycan pack leaders stood on one side, clad in dark furs and leather, their golden eyes glowing with suspicion. On the other, the human nobles huddled in their silks and velvets, their faces pale masks of fear. Ilara stood between them, a ghost in a simple gown of white silk, a stark contrast to Kaelin, who wore the black, armored leathers of a warrior king. An ancient blind priestess, a relic from a time before the usurpation, was summoned to invoke the magical law, her voice a dry whisper that made the very air hum with a heavy, binding power. The vows they spoke were not of love or devotion, but of iron and blood. They were a contract recited before a hostile audience, each word a carefully placed stone in the foundation of their new, unstable kingdom. Kaelin's voice was a low, resonant growl, a promise of dominion and order. I take you, Ilara of House Valerius, as the chain to bind this kingdom. I will be its shield, its sword, and its king. Ilara's voice, when she spoke, was clear and cold as winter ice, betraying none of her inner turmoil. I take you, Kaelin of the true royal line, as the price of peace. I pledge my loyalty not to the man, but to the crown and the people of Eldoria. The unspoken words screamed between them. I hate you. I do this only for survival. This is a prison for us both. The tension was a living thing, a coiled serpent in the heart of the court. Instead of rings, the ancient rite demanded a binding of hands and a shared oath. The priestess brought forth a single cord of woven silver and crimson, symbolizing the union of Lycan magic and royal human blood. Kaelin took Ilara's hand, and the contact was a jolt of lightning. His skin was rough, calloused, and radiated a startling, feral heat that seeped into her cold flesh. She flinched, but his grip was like iron, unyielding, as the priestess wrapped the cord around their joined wrists. A faint, shimmering light pulsed from the threads, a visible manifestation of the magical pact sealing their fates together. For a moment, their eyes met over their bound hands, and in his molten gold gaze, she saw not just a king, but a predator who had just trapped his prey, only to find the trap had closed on him as well. The final act of the binding was a kiss to seal the contract in the eyes of gods and men. It was meant to be a performance, a public display of unity for the divided court. Kaelin turned to her, his expression unreadable, and for a heart-stopping moment, Ilara thought he would refuse. But then he leaned in, his shadow falling over her, and the world narrowed to the space between their lips. The kiss was not gentle or hesitant. It was a raw, possessive claiming, a brand of ownership that stole the breath from her lungs. It was fire and ice, a clash of wills. He expected submission, a fragile doll to be dominated, but he found resistance. She met the brutal pressure of his mouth with a surprising, defiant firmness, a silent declaration that she would not be broken by him or this cage. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathless, the echoes of the kiss a thunder in their veins. His golden eyes, usually burning with cold fury, now held a flicker of stunned surprise, a raw, unwilling fascination that mirrored the chaos in her own heart. A traitorous blush stained her cheeks, a crack in the icy composure she had so carefully maintained. The magic of the bond settled around them, no longer a hum, but a tangible, shimmering weight. A chain forged of duty and destiny that only they could feel. The court, sensing the shift, erupted into a discordant symphony of forced cheers from the humans and low, rumbling growls from the Lycans. The performance was over, but the terrifying reality of their union had just begun. Del lik si ya te enganchaste y suscríbete para más romances épicos. Their first duty as king and queen was to present their united front to the city. The procession from the throne room to the grand balcony was a new form of exquisite torture. Kaelin's hand rested on the small of her back, a proprietary gesture that was both a public claim and a private threat. The heat of his touch burned through the thin silk of her gown, a constant, unnerving reminder of his presence. She could feel the coiled strength in his body, smell the wild scent of pine and cold mountain air that clung to him like a second skin. The nobles of her father's court bowed their heads as they passed, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resentment. Kaelin's Lycan warriors parted for them, their gazes sharp and assessing, making it clear that she was accepted only because their alpha commanded it. Stepping onto the balcony, they were met with a wave of sound from the courtyard below. A vast sea of faces stared up at them, a volatile mix of terrified humans and triumphant Lycans, their factions clearly divided even in the sprawling crowd. A tense hush fell as they saw the Wolf King standing beside the usurper's daughter, his arm possessively around her waist. Kaelin raised their joined hands, a silent, powerful declaration of his victory and their new reality. A roar erupted from the masses, a fractured, chaotic sound of celebration, anger, and uncertainty. Ilara felt the vibration travel up through the stone beneath her feet. The very heartbeat of a kingdom on the brink of tearing itself apart, she was the symbol of its fragile peace, a queen crowned in fear. Amid the cacophony, Kaelin's grip on her hand tightened, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. His gaze was not on the adoring or hating faces below, but fixed on the distant, dark horizon, a flicker of profound weariness crossing his features. In that unguarded instant, the formidable Alpha King vanished, and for a heartbeat, she saw only the exiled prince, a man bearing the weight of a stolen past and an uncertain future. The sight struck a chord deep within her, a strange resonance with her own suffocating isolation. Surrounded by thousands, they were two solitary figures on a precipice, bound by a shared sentence. She realized then that his throne was as much a cage for him as this marriage was for her, a revelation that subtly, dangerously began to shift the ground beneath her feet. As they turned to retreat from the balcony's edge, a towering Lycan warrior stepped into their path, his presence a wall of muscle and menace. It was Fenris, Kaelin's most trusted beta, his face a mask of undisguised contempt as his gaze fell upon Ilara. An alpha's strength is measured by his bite, not by the gilded leash he wears, he snarled, his voice a low growl meant only for the three of them to hear. The air crackled, freezing into a tense, dangerous silence. It was the first open challenge to Kaelin's authority, a direct threat aimed at the weakest link in his new regime, her. It was a stark reminder that the war for this kingdom was far from over. It had merely moved from the battlefield into the shadows of their own court. Kaelin did not erupt with the feral rage Fenris clearly anticipated. His reaction was quieter, colder, and infinitely more terrifying. He moved with liquid deadliness, pulling Ilara flush against his side, his arm a band of unyielding steel that was both a shield and a claim. He met his beta's insubordinate glare with an ice-cold calm that promised a slow, brutal death. "She is not my leash," Kaelin corrected, his voice a lethal whisper that vibrated through Ilara's entire body. "She is my queen, and you will accord her the respect she is owed, or you will answer directly to me." The raw, possessive power in his words stunned Fenris into silence, but it was the simple, possessive pronoun my that echoed in the air, shocking the court, the beta, and most profoundly, Ilara herself. It was supposed to be an act, but it sounded terrifyingly, irrevocably real. The days that followed the ceremony bled into a tense, fragile routine, a performance enacted on a stage of polished marble and simmering hatred. Public meals in the Great Hall were an exercise in controlled theatre. Ilara sat at Kaelin's right hand, a silent, beautiful queen, while he presided over his court of warriors. She watched him, not as her captor, but as a king. He listened to the grievances of his pack leaders with an unnerving stillness, his golden eyes missing nothing. He was harsh but never unjust, his judgment swift and final. There was a raw, untamed authority in him that both terrified and fascinated her. In these moments, she saw the leader his people followed into battle, the alpha who commanded not just fear, but a fierce, unyielding loyalty that her father had only ever bought with gold and threats. One rain-swept afternoon, seeking refuge from the oppressive court, Ilara found herself in the castle's dust-choked library, a place few had entered since her father's reign began. She ran her fingers over the spine of a forbidden text, the Song of the Wolf Kings, a history of Kaelin's ancestors. As she read of their legends, a shadow fell over the page. Kaelin stood behind her. Silent as a wraith, she tensed, expecting anger, but his expression was unreadable. "My mother used to read that to me," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the very dust motes in the air. She said the songs of our ancestors were the only maps that could guide a king's soul. For a breathless moment, the chasm between them vanished, replaced by a shared, ghostly memory of a world before the blood and betrayal. The fragile peace of their private understanding was shattered during the first meeting of the new, unified council. Lord Theron, a portly noble whose loyalty shifted with the political winds, rose to his feet. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice dripping with false deference while his eyes fixed on Ilara. "While we all appreciate the symbolism of this union, one must question the wisdom of allowing the usurper's bloodline a voice in state matters. A pretty chain is meant for display, not for counsel." The insult hung in the air, a vile poison. The human lords shifted uncomfortably, while the Lycan alphas watched with predatory stillness. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face, the familiar shame a cold weight in her stomach. She was once again nothing more than her father's daughter. Before Ilara could even form a response, Kaelin moved. He didn't rise, he didn't raise his voice. He simply leaned forward, resting his elbows on the great stone table, and the temperature in the room plummeted. His golden eyes, cold as winter stars, locked onto Lord Theron. "The Queen's bloodline is now my bloodline, by the oldest law of this land," he stated, his voice a quiet, lethal promise. "Her voice is my voice, her counsel is my command, and this chain, as you so foolishly call it, is what holds this kingdom and your pathetic life together." He paused, letting the threat settle like a shroud. "Question her place at this table again, and I will personally show you the purpose of a wolf's teeth." Theron paled, sinking back into his chair, and the council chamber was utterly, terrifyingly silent. Later, she found him on the battlements, staring out at the darkening sky as if challenging the coming storm. The wind whipped strands of his dark hair across his face. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling small and hollow against the vastness of the evening. He didn't turn. "It was a necessary political move," he replied curtly, his voice snatched by the wind. "They needed to see that an attack on you is an attack on me. It maintains the illusion of unity." But as he spoke, his jaw tightened, and she saw the knuckles of the hand resting on the stone parapet were white. It hadn't been just politics. He had been genuinely, personally furious. That raw, protective anger was a far more dangerous and confusing thing to confront than his cold indifference had ever been. The court, ever a nest of vipers, continued to test their boundaries. During a royal feast, a young, brash Lycan warrior named Rorick, emboldened by wine, approached Ilara with a roguish grin. He presented her with a single, perfect moon petal, a flower that bloomed only in the deepest parts of the Shadowlands. "A bloom from the wild for our wild queen," he said, his eyes lingering on her a moment too long. From across the hall, Kaelin saw the exchange. The air around him seemed to crackle. He set his goblet down with a soft, deliberate click and moved through the crowd, not with haste, but with the inexorable purpose of a hunting wolf. He reached Ilara's side, said nothing to Rorick, but simply slid his arm around her waist, pulling her flush against him in an act of blatant possession. his golden eyes burning with a silent, lethal warning until the young warrior bowed stiffly and fled. Alone that night in her cavernous chambers, Ilara replayed the day's events. His cold, deadly defense in the council, the simmering, possessive fury during the feast. She paced before the fire, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. This was not part of their contract. Their agreement was for a performance of civility, a political charade to placate the court. It was not supposed to involve genuine anger or raw jealousy. These were real emotions, cracks in the unyielding armor of the Alpha King. She pressed her fingers to her lips, the memory of their ceremonial kiss, brutal and claiming, suddenly vivid. Are we really just pretending? The question echoed in the silent room, a terrifying, thrilling whisper that threatened to unravel the very foundations of the careful world she was trying to build for herself. The council remained a battlefield where she fought for every inch of ground. The human lords patronized her, dismissing her insights with condescending smiles, while the Lycan alphas viewed her with perpetual suspicion, their gazes sharp and assessing. She was an outsider to both, a queen with no true people. Yet, during a heated debate over grain shortages in the Western Territories, a region loyal to her father, she found her voice. Drawing on years of tedious lessons in logistics and trade routes, she outlined a detailed, practical plan for redistribution that was both fair to the starving populace and strategically sound. For the first time, a stunned silence fell over the chamber, broken only by the scratching of a scribe's quill as he hurried to record her words. She had proven she was more than a symbol. Kalen offered no praise during the meeting, his face an impassive mask. But that evening, a guard delivered a summons. She found him not in the throne room, but in the royal war room, a chamber she had never been permitted to enter. It was filled with maps and strategic markers. He didn't look up from a large chart of the northern territories. The supply lines to the Frostfang garrison are vulnerable, he said, his voice gruff. The nobles you just placated are likely planning to sabotage them. He straightened up and finally met her gaze, his golden eyes intense. You know their methods. You know their lands. Devise a new route. Secure it. It was not a request. It was a transfer of immense responsibility, a stark and undeniable admission that he trusted her mind, if not her name. This began a new phase of their arrangement. They spent long nights in the war room, the only light from a single candelabra casting their shadows long and distorted on the walls. The vast oak table between them became their world, a landscape of ink and parchment. They argued, their voices low and sharp, debating strategies and troop movements. But beneath the friction was a growing current of grudging respect. She saw the immense pressure he was under, a king trying to stitch a nation back together with his own blood and will. He, in turn, saw the keen intellect and unwavering resilience she had been forced to conceal her entire life. In the shared silence of those late hours, the ghost of her father and the spectre of his revenge began to feel more distant. If you've made it this far, you're already part of this community. Subscribe so you don't miss a single story. Their fragile partnership was soon put to its most severe test. A messenger arrived, breathless and pale, bearing news of a virulent plague sweeping through the Greywater marshes, a remote region where human villagers and a reclusive Lycan clan lived in a delicate, centuries-old truce. The news ripped through the council, reigniting old hatreds. The human lords demanded a full quarantine, willing to sacrifice the entire region to contain the sickness. Fenris, speaking for the Lycans, argued for sending in their own mystics, an act that would be seen as an invasion by the terrified humans. As chaos erupted, Ilara remembered a passage from a forbidden herbalism text, detailing a cure using a rare combination of mountain herbs and marsh roots, a remedy that would require both human and Lycan knowledge to create. With all eyes upon her, Ilara stood and proposed the unthinkable, a joint relief mission, led by her and Kaelin personally. She argued that they could not only deliver a cure, but also present a powerful symbol of unity to a kingdom that desperately needed one. The council was thrown into an uproar. It was a monumental gamble, a political and personal risk of the highest order. Fenris snarled that his king would not risk his life for a pack of superstitious humans. Lord Theron declared she was sentencing the crown to death, but Kaelin watched her, his expression unreadable. As she laid out her plan, he saw not the plea of a desperate woman, but the calculated strategy of a queen. And in that moment, he made a decision that would either forge their kingdom or shatter it into dust. The journey to the Greywater marshes was a silent, agonizing trek. They rode side by side, a king and queen, presenting a united front to the wary soldiers and Lycan warriors who followed. But an impassable chasm of cold silence had opened between them. Every accidental brush of their hands was a jolt of static. Every shared glance across the campfire was fraught with an unspoken tension that was heavier than armor. Kaelin had retreated completely behind the mask of the Alpha King, his face a granite carving of duty and command. He issued orders with cold precision and spoke to her only when absolutely necessary, his voice devoid of the warmth that had begun to seep into their late-night strategy sessions. Ilara felt the withdrawal like a physical blow, a brutal severing of the fragile thread that had begun to weave them together. He was pushing her away, and the coldness was more terrifying than his initial rage had ever been. On the third night, under a sliver of a moon that offered no comfort, she finally confronted him, away from the prying eyes of the camp. "Why?" she demanded, her voice a raw whisper against the chirping of crickets. "Why are you doing this? After everything we have built?" Kaelin turned from the fire, his golden eyes filled with a torment that stole her breath. "Because what we are building is a lie," he confessed, his voice ragged with a pain he could no longer conceal. "There is a price for the magic that binds us, Ilara. The priestess told me after the ceremony. The bond demands a true union within a year, a union of heart and soul, not just of crowns. If it is not forged, the magic will shatter the pact and claim its price in blood. It will kill you." The confession fell between them, a death sentence that retroactively poisoned every moment of their growing intimacy. The world tilted on its axis, the crackling fire and the dark woods dissolving into a blur of horror. His protection in the council, his possessive anger at the feast, his grudging trust in the war room, it was all tainted. It wasn't respect or affection, it was a desperate attempt to manage the terms of her execution. "So I am just another strategic problem to be solved?" she asked, the words laced with a bitterness that felt like acid on her tongue. "A life to be saved, to prevent your kingdom from descending into chaos." The pain of his betrayal was a physical agony, far sharper than any fear of death. She had allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that she was more than a symbol, that the man was beginning to see the woman. Now she saw it was all just another performance, the most cruel and elaborate one of all. "No!" The word was torn from him, a raw, desperate sound that was more animal than human. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his hands hovering in the air as if he were afraid to touch her, to taint her further. "When she told me, my crown, my kingdom, none of it mattered. All I could see was you, trapped in another cage, this one built of my ambition and their cursed magic. I thought if I kept my distance, if I made you hate me, the bond would never form. I thought I could protect you from me." His voice broke, the confession a torrent of raw, unguarded emotion. "I would let this entire kingdom burn to ash before I let that magic touch you. I brought you into this war, Ilara. I will not be the reason you do not survive it." His words were a devastating, beautiful poison. It was a confession of profound care, a declaration that she had become more valuable to him than the throne he had fought a decade to reclaim. Yet it was a truth born from a death sentence, a flower blooming on the edge of a grave. How could she possibly trust it? How could she believe in a feeling cultivated under the shadow of a magical executioner's axe? She looked into his tormented golden eyes and saw a reflection of her own fractured heart. They were trapped, not by their enemies or their court, but by a fate they had unwittingly sealed with their own vows. The chasm between them was now filled with a terrible, impossible truth, making them closer and more irrevocably broken than ever before. There was no easy path forward, only a future paved with impossible choices. They arrived in the Greywater marshes as saviors, their inner turmoil masterfully concealed behind masks of royal unity. Their joint mission was a stunning success, the cure they devised working faster than anyone had hoped, forging a new, fragile trust between the local humans and Lycans. They returned to the capital as heroes. Their procession met with genuine cheers from a populace desperate for hope. Seizing the political momentum, Kaelin immediately convened a grand assembly in the throne room. The air was electric with triumph and expectation as the nobles and pack alphas gathered. Ilara stood beside him at the foot of the throne, her heart hammering against her ribs, the weight of his secret a suffocating shroud. The hall fell silent as Kaelin prepared to address his court, and she had no idea if he was about to secure their future or announce their doom. Instead of the triumphant speech his court expected, Kaelin began to speak of sacrifice. His voice, usually a commander's roar, was low and resonant, capturing the attention of every noble and warrior in the vast hall. "Peace is not won on the battlefield alone," he declared, his golden eyes sweeping over the sea of faces before finally landing and staying on Ilara. "It is paid for with a currency far more precious than blood. We sealed our union with an ancient law, believing it was a tool to bind a kingdom. We were wrong. This magic is not a tool. It is a living entity. It does not accept political convenience. It demands a truth of the heart, and if that truth is not given, it claims a life as its price." A collective gasp rippled through the room as the nobles and alphas realized this was not a celebration, but a reckoning. The air grew thick with a dreadful, dawning understanding. He turned his body fully toward Ilara, creating an intimate island for the two of them in the center of the stunned court. "The price for a false union," he announced, his voice raw with an emotion no one had ever heard from him, "is the Queen's life." The words fell like stones into a silent pool, and the horror on the faces before him was absolute. "I brought this fate upon her. I intended to use her, a symbol to secure my throne, and in my arrogance, I sentenced her to death. I tried to protect her by pushing her away, by building walls of ice around a bond that was slowly, against my will, becoming real." He took a step closer, his gaze burning with a desperate public confession. "I was a fool. A life without her is not a victory. A throne without her is just a colder cage. I will not let this magic or this crown take her from me." All eyes, 100 pairs of them, swiveled to Ilara. She felt stripped bare, her heart's deepest turmoil laid out for public judgment. But in Kaelin's confession, she found not shame, but a profound, earth-shattering freedom. She stepped forward, meeting him in the center of the floor, and her voice, when she spoke, was clear and strong. "I stood in this hall as a sacrifice, willing to be a chain to atone for my father's sins. I saw only a beast king, a specter of vengeance." She looked from the human lords to the Lycan alphas. "But I was wrong. I saw a king who carries the weight of two peoples. I saw a man who would sacrifice his own crown to save the life of his enemy's daughter." A faint, shimmering golden light began to emanate from where their hands almost touched, the magic of their bond awakening, responding to the truth now spoken aloud. "This union is no longer a chain," she declared. "It is a choice. He closed the final inch between them, his hands coming up to cup her face with a reverence that made her entire body tremble. The raw power of the Alpha King was still there, but it was tempered by a vulnerability that was for her alone. "Elara," he breathed, the name a prayer and a promise. The golden light around them pulsed, a silent, magical affirmation visible to the entire court. He ignored the gasps, the whispers, the shifting political landscape. In that moment, there was only her. He lowered his head and kissed her, and it was a kiss that remade the world. It was not the brutal claiming of their ceremony, nor a performance for their subjects. It was a seal, a vow, a desperate and soul-deep surrender. It was the taste of forgiveness, the feeling of home, and the silent promise of a shared dawn. The light flared, then softened, leaving them bound by something far stronger than magic. The whispers in the castle were finally silenced, replaced by the murmur of a hopeful court. Their bond, once a chain of duty, had become an anchor in the storm. A new song was being written for Eldoria, one of hope born from the ashes of hatred. This story ends, but there are many more waiting for you. Next week, a forgotten sorceress from a lost bloodline will discover her magic is tied to a celestial dragon who demands an impossible price for his power. Dale like si esta historia te atrapó. Suscríbete para la próxima. Comenta qué momento te impactó más, for in the heart of the wolf, the captive dove found her sky.